It's just after 11:30 p.m. on December 29th, 1972. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is descending towards Miami International Airport after a smooth trip down from New York. The crew, Captain Robert Loft, First Officer Albert Stockstill, and Flight Engineer Donald Repo are setting up for landing when a small indicator light on the control panel refuses to turn on. It's the light that confirms whether the nose gear is locked. Loft sends Repo to the electronics bay to check the mechanism by hand. Stockstill keeps the jet in a slow holding pattern over the dark Everglades while the crew troubleshoots the problem. The autopilot is engaged. At 11:42 p.m., while everyone's focused on that one bulb, the plane begins to lose altitude, so gradually no one notices. There's no warning chime, no call out from air traffic control. The altimeter unwinds unnoticed as the ground closes in. Seconds later, the Lockheed L-1011 hits the swamp at more than 200 miles per hour. Of the 176 people aboard, 101 are killed, 75 survive. In the months that follow, investigators will learn the nose gear was down and locked the whole time. The only real malfunction was a $12 light bulb. And before long, crews flying other L-1011s in Eastern's fleet will begin whispering about what they're seeing in those planes, faces they recognize from Flight 401. The crash site was deep in the Everglades, so remote that rescuers had to reach it by airboat and helicopter. Investigators spent weeks wading through water and sawgrass, recovering wreckage and identifying victims. The official report from the National Transportation Safety Board was clear. There was no structural failure, no engine trouble, and no weather issue. The crew had simply lost track of their altitude while focusing on that one faulty light. The L-1011 was an advanced jet for its time, but it couldn't overcome a basic human error. Eastern Airlines quietly salvaged usable components from the wreck. That was standard procedure. Many of those parts were installed in other aircraft of the same model. And that's where the next chapter of this story begins. Over the following year, flight crews began reporting something unusual. Pilots, attendants, even ground staff claimed they'd seen Captain Loft and Flight Engineer Repo on flights that never carried their names on the manifest. Officially, Eastern dismissed the stories. The company called them rumors, the kind that appear after any tragedy. But some of the people who'd claimed to see them weren't passengers or casual observers. They were fellow employees, people who'd worked with those men for years. I'm your host, Robert Barber. Tonight's story takes us above the clouds to a flight that ended in the Florida Everglades. A routine landing, a sudden descent, and more than 100 lives lost in the dark. This is the story of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 and the faces that some say never left the sky. This is State of the Unknown. In the months after the crash, Eastern Airlines worked quickly to restore a sense of routine. The NTSB investigation was complete, the cause was understood, and the company began salvaging what it could from the wreck in the Everglades. Engines, ovens, galleys, even cockpit panels were recovered, cleaned, and certified for reuse in other L-1011s. In commercial aviation, that wasn't unusual. Aircraft components were expensive, and if they passed inspection, they went back into service. No one at the time imagined that decision would give rise to one of aviation's strangest legends. The earliest stories surfaced in early 1973. Flight attendants working the Miami-New York route reported seeing a uniformed officer seated in first class before passengers had boarded. When they tried to verify his ticket, he wasn't listed on the manifest. He disappeared before departure. The attendants later compared descriptions and each identified the same man from a photo on a crew room bulletin board: Captain Robert Loft, the pilot of Flight 401. Around the same time, a maintenance crew at Miami International prepared another L-1011 for a short turnaround flight. While running pre-departure checks, a mechanic heard movement in the avionics bay below the cockpit. He opened the hatch and, according to his later statement to colleagues, saw flight engineer Donald Repo looking up at him. Repo was easily recognized. He's worked at the base for years. The man allegedly said, "Don't worry about the pre-flight, I've already done it." When the mechanic climbed down moments later, the compartment was empty. Most of the early reports came from within Eastern itself, people who'd known Loft and Repo personally. But before long, passenger stories began filtering through the same rumor mill. One woman was said to have mentioned a quiet pilot seated next to her before takeoff. When a flight attendant checked, the seat was empty. Another passenger supposedly pointed towards the cockpit and asked if the airline always let passengers visit the flight crew before boarding. According to later retellings, the description again matched Captain Loft. These accounts were never verified. No names, no flight numbers, no official records. They appear only in secondary sources, passed along by Eastern staff and later cited in John G. Fuller's 1976 book, The Ghost of Flight 401. None of these stories were entered in official maintenance or incident logs, but they circulated constantly among crews. A few made their way to the safety office, where managers tried to keep the talk contained. Several former employees told Fuller that an internal memo eventually reminded staff not to discuss unauthorized reports of supernatural phenomena with passengers or the press. No copy of that memo has ever been found, and Eastern never confirmed its existence, so that detail remains unverified. Fuller's book gathered interviews from pilots, attendants, and ground staff who claimed to have witnessed Loft or Repo on other jets in the fleet. He cited specific aircraft, tail numbers N318EA and N308EA, that, according to his source, had been fitted with salvaged components from the crash. Fuller wrote that once those parts were replaced, the sighting stopped. There's no official maintenance documentation proving that connection. The FAA's service records from the 1970s weren't detailed enough to track individual part reuse. But within Eastern, the pattern felt uncanny. Almost every reported encounter took place on a plane rumored to carry pieces of Flight 401. Some accounts were vivid. One flight attendant said she entered a galley and saw Repo's reflection in the oven door, only to realize she was alone. A pilot described seeing Loft standing in the cockpit doorway as he completed his pre-flight checklist. In both cases, the witnesses insisted the figures looked solid, not ghostly, and vanished without sound. Whether those details were later colored by retelling is impossible to confirm, but they helped the legend spread fast. By mid-1973, newspapers in Miami and New York began picking up the story. Eastern's press office issued a short statement denying any knowledge of ghost activity on its aircraft and emphasizing that all reused components were fully inspected and safe. Internally, company counselors met with several employees who said the experiences left them uneasy about flying. Management wanted to contain the distraction, not challenge the reports directly. For many at Eastern, Flight 401 had become more than a tragedy in the company's history. It was a loss that seemed to linger in familiar places, in galleys, in cockpits, in reflections, reminding crews of friends they'd never expected to see again. Whether the sightings were born of trauma, coincidence, or something beyond explanation, they marked the beginning of a legend that refused to fade. By 1974, what had started as quiet talk in crew lounges had spread beyond Eastern Airlines. Reporters in Miami and New York began hearing whispers about haunted planes, and a few short newspaper items hinted at unusual stories from flight crews who didn't want their names printed. Eastern's management tried to stamp it out, calling the rumors fabrications, but the harder they pushed back, the more intriguing the story became. In 1976, writer John G. Fuller, already known for The Interrupted Journey about the Betty and Barney Hill UFO case, published The Ghost of Flight 401. Fuller based the book on more than 50 interviews with Eastern employees, retired crew, and family members of the crash victims. He presented their accounts in careful detail: names, aircraft tail numbers, and the specific flights where sightings allegedly occurred. He included multiple versions of the same incidents, giving readers a sense of how stories overlapped but never matched exactly. Fuller admitted that not every account could be verified, but argued that, quote, too many credible professionals had reported seeing Captain Loft or Engineer Repo to ignore. The book sold well. For many readers, it was their first exposure to the crash itself. The fact that a single light bulb failure had triggered one of the worst aviation disasters of its era, and the ghost reports were an irresistible follow-up. Airline employees and frequent flyers debated the story on radio talk shows. By that summer, the ghost of Flight 401 had become a national curiosity. Eastern Airlines, already struggling with fuel costs and competition, viewed the publicity as a threat. Executives publicly dismissed Fuller's work as fiction, and company spokespeople repeated that there had never been a single documented complaint from a passenger about ghosts or apparitions. Privately, though, Eastern's public relations staff kept files of press clippings and sent internal memos advising crews not to comment to journalists. One former flight attendant later told an interviewer that even mentioning the book on duty could earn a formal reprimand. Eastern wanted the story to disappear as completely as the men it described. In 1978, NBC released a made-for-television film adaptation starring Ernest Borgnine and Gary Lockwood. The movie dramatized both the crash and the supernatural aftermath, portraying Repo as a protective spirit guiding later flights to safety. It softened the tragedy into something hopeful, an after-death hero story, and that tone made it a Sunday night hit. For viewers, the line between documented fact and dramatic license blurred further. For Eastern, the broadcast reopened a wound it wanted closed. The airline again issued statements denying that any of the depicted events had occurred and insisting that all reused components from Flight 401 had long since been removed. Despite Eastern's denials, the legend found its own momentum. Aviation magazines published letters from readers claiming to have spoken with former crew members who confirmed parts of the story. Paranormal researchers included Flight 401 in lists of credible hauntings because so many witnesses were trained professionals: pilots, engineers, attendants, people accustomed to precise observation and checklists. Skeptics countered that trauma and survivors' guilt were powerful forces, and that stories repeated in tight-knit workspaces can take on lives of their own. By the early 1980s, the airline industry had largely moved on. Eastern retired or sold many of its L-1011s, and newer aircraft replaced them. The sightings tapered off, but the story never fully vanished. Fuller's book stayed in print for decades, and the film re-aired on cable every few years, each time reaching a new audience. Even today, when former Eastern crew gather at reunions, someone inevitably mentions Flight 401. The room quiets for a moment, and the conversation drifts to who was flying that night, who made it out, and what people said they saw after. By the time the headlines faded and the book sales slowed, Flight 401 had become more than a ghost story. It was a parable, one that lived at the intersection of technology, tragedy, and human need. The NTSB investigation left no ambiguity. There was no mechanical failure, no weather anomaly, no act of sabotage. The crash was the result of a simple chain of errors: a burned-out light bulb that distracted the crew, an autopilot accidentally nudged out of altitude hold, and a flight deck so focused on one problem that it missed another. It was a human story, and that may be the very reason it became a supernatural one. In the wake of the accident, aviation safety changed. Procedures for cockpit teamwork and communication were rewritten. The term crew resource management, now standard in pilot training, was born in part from what happened that night in the Everglades. Pilots learned to challenge one another, to cross-check instruments, and to never let a single issue monopolize attention. In that way, Flight 401 saved lives long after the crash. But for the people who had known the crew, for those who still walked past their empty lockers or saw their names on duty rosters that hadn't been updated, that institutional progress didn't erase the loss. They were left with a void that a report couldn't fill. And it's often in those spaces, between fact and feeling, where ghost stories begin. Psychologists who studied post-crash trauma in the 1970s described a phenomenon they called residual presence. It's not necessarily supernatural. It's the brain's way of reconciling a sudden absence, replaying a voice, a silhouette, or a moment of routine that now feels haunted by what's missing. People who experience it often aren't delusional, they're processing grief. In that sense, a haunting can be an emotional echo, an encounter with memory rather than spirit. Still, there's something about the Flight 401 accounts that continues to capture attention. These weren't tourists or self-proclaimed psychics. They were trained professionals, pilots, engineers, attendants, people used to structure, checklists, and verification. They weren't looking for ghosts. That contrast is what makes the legend so sticky. It's also what made it believable to many who heard it at the time. If a random passenger says they saw a ghost, it's dismissed as imagination. But when the person saying it wears a uniform, when they've logged thousands of flight hours, people listen differently. It gave the story a kind of credibility that folklore usually doesn't get. At the same time, the haunting of Flight 401 reflected something larger happening in the culture. The early 1970s were full of uncertainty, new technology, a shaky economy, and a growing fascination with the unexplained. Films like The Exorcist and The Legend of Hell House were in theaters. Paranormal research groups were popping up all around the country. America was in what one historian later called a haunted decade, where faith, science, and fear all shared the same space. So when word spread that a modern jetliner might carry ghosts, it felt perfectly of its time, a collision between progress and the past. And Flight 401 was the perfect vessel for that story, a symbol of cutting-edge aviation struck down by human oversight, now rumored to carry something that defied reason. It merged tragedy with wonder, and in doing so, became modern folklore. To this day, researchers who've revisited the story note that no verified documentation connects the salvaged parts from the Flight 401 to the planes where the sighting supposedly occurred. There are no photographs, no surviving memos, no maintenance logs that prove those components were ever reused in the way the legend describes. That absence of proof doesn't necessarily end the conversation, though. It just shifts where the story lives. What we have instead are memories. First-hand accounts passed down through interviews, conversations among former crew, and retellings that grew slightly different each time they were told. It's what folklorists call living memory. Stories that exist in circulation, not in archives. Each retelling keeps the experience alive for another generation, even if the details drift. For some, that's frustrating. They want evidence that can be tested, data that can be logged. But for others, that ambiguity is the point. The Flight 401 story sits between the rational and the emotional, between what can be proven and what still feels true. When Eastern Airlines finally went bankrupt in 1991, some of its former employees said it felt like closing a long, unfinished chapter. The company was gone. The L-1011s were retired or sold, and the physical traces of the crash had finally disappeared from the fleet. But at reunions and industry gatherings, the subject still came up. Someone would mention Flight 401 and the tone of the room would shift. The conversation would turn quieter, the way people talk when they're remembering someone rather than something. Maybe that's the real reason the story endures. It's not just about ghosts on airplanes. It's about people trying to understand loss and the way grief can take on a shape of its own. Whether the sightings were hallucinations, coincidences, or something truly unexplained, they offered a way for the living to believe their colleagues were still close by. And in that sense, the haunting of Flight 401 isn't about fear at all. It's about connection, a final act of presence from those who never made it home. When I think about Flight 401, I don't just hear a ghost story. I hear people, coworkers, friends, trying to make sense of an empty seat, an empty locker, or a voice that used to answer back. Loss leaves behind spaces we don't know how to fill. And when something happens suddenly, when there's no warning, no time to say goodbye, the mind does what it can to bridge the gap. Sometimes it imagines presence where there shouldn't be any. Sometimes it simply recognizes that the connection hasn't gone away. Most of the sightings after Flight 401 came from the people who knew Captain Loft and Engineer Repo best, their fellow crew. Pilots saw Loft standing in cockpit doorways. Attendants swore they saw Repo's reflection in gallery oven doors. Later, even a few passengers claimed to have seen the same men sitting quietly before takeoff, only for them to vanish when someone looked closer. Those passenger accounts were never verified, but the people who told them sounded sincere, and they matched what so many others had already described. As for what I think, I believe them. I think something about that night and about those men didn't end in the swamp. Whether you call it energy, consciousness, or something we just don't have words for yet, I think they stayed with the planes they knew, still doing the jobs they loved. Maybe they were making sure the mistakes that took them down never happened again. Stories like this don't exist in isolation. After the crash of American Airlines Flight 191 near Chicago, locals reported seeing lights moving in the field where the jet came down. Sailors on the USS Enterprise in World War II told of crewmates still walking the decks after battle. Legends of ghost trains in Sweden and Chicago describe locomotives still running routes that no longer exist. Even survivors of the Titanic claim to hear phantom Morse signals from the Atlantic. Each of those stories carries the same thread: a need to believe that the people we lose don't just disappear. Maybe that's why the haunting of Flight 401 endures. It reminds us that grief doesn't always stay grounded. It travels through stories, through objects, through the machines we build and the lives they carry. And sometimes, it leaves a trace strong enough to follow us back home. If Loft and Repo really are still out there, I don't think they mean to frighten anyone. I think they're still doing what they always did: keeping watch, quietly, from somewhere just beyond the cockpit door. This has been State of the Unknown. A routine flight that never made it to Miami. A quiet light on a control panel. And the two men who, even after impact, may have refused to stop flying. For more than 50 years, Flight 401 has remained part of aviation's memory. A reminder that the skies hold stories as human as the people who fly through them. Maybe that's why this one still lingers. Because belief, like flight itself, is an act of faith. And some stories just won't stay on the ground. If you've been enjoying State of the Unknown, thank you for listening, and for helping this little show keep growing week after week. The best way you can support it is simple. Leave a quick rating or review. On Spotify, it's just a tap. On Apple Podcasts, a few words make a huge difference. I read every single one, and I can't tell you how much it means. Until next time, stay curious. Stay unsettled. And the next time you fly, maybe give a quiet nod to the crew who might still be watching over you.